For more than 1,000 days, Ukraine has fought relentlessly against Russian aggression. And in that time, thousands have been killed on both sides. Now, 2024 saw the conflict reach yet more milestones. New front lines were opened, new weapons were used, ever more sophisticated drones were deployed. Leaders on either side have dug in defiant, but with Donald Trump about to take power again in America, there is a sense something may be about to change. Now, he's promised to end the war in 24 hours. Whether that bombast proves true remains to be seen, but what we can be sure, war weariness is growing. A recent poll found 52% of Ukrainians now want the war over as soon as possible, up from 27% the year before. So could 2025 see negotiation and a ceasefire, or will it bring more of the same misery of war? In this special programme, we'll look at the front line and how it's changed over the course of 2024. We'll assess how technology, from new equipment to the drone revolution, is changing the dynamics. We'll examine what a year of elections meant, the geopolitics of it all, and who else is now involved, from Donald Trump to Kim Jong-un. And we'll see whether this was the year that signalled a move toward a solution which will stop the bloodshed. And to go through all of that, someone who has been our expert guide since the war broke out, our security and defence analyst, Professor Michael Clarke. Now, before we get Michael's analysis, let's take a look back at the key moments from the front line in 2024.
We've got to move out, it's too dangerous. Cluster bombs, mortar fire, artillery. The forest is alive with this stuff.
Ukraine has suddenly hit back against Russia, and it's launched what appears to be a very significant incursion in the region of Kursk.
This was the place from where Ukraine launched its counter-offensive.
I thank every unit of our defense forces that makes this happen. Ukraine is proving that it really knows how to restore justice.
We're hurtling now in the dark towards the front line.
Generation of Ukrainians are dying on the battlefield.
You can see devastation here.
Their fellow citizens are trying to hold the line.
So, Michael, just take us through how the front line has changed in this past year.
Yeah, Kamali, it doesn't look as if it's changed all that much. We're looking at the same map all year, but actually a lot has gone on this year, and so there's been a lot of dynamism in the war. If we look at it from January, that's the map we were all fairly familiar with. The Russians put in a big effort from about March onwards to push the front forward, always everywhere, across the whole thing. And as the year has gone on, you can see what's happened. They took Bakhmut, didn't do them much good because it was not really strategically so important. They've pushed towards Chavez Yar. That is important, high ground. They still haven't got it, but if they get it, that helps them to go north. They did take Avdiivka at the early part of the year, and that is important because that actually is strategically important because it goes towards Pokrovsk. If they get Pokrovsk, then that opens the road to the west, to Dnipro, and they've moved forward. But this was August. In August, the Ukrainians changed the dynamic a bit. They attacked in Kursk, right up in the north. Now, Kursk is a region of Russia. It's an oblast. It's actually a very big oblast. The Ukrainians attacked a rather small part of it, but nevertheless, this is Russian territory. They actually invaded Russia. And within that Kursk oblast, they conducted themselves very carefully. They took Sudza, and they kept going sideways towards the northwest and the southeast. So it kept their flanks small so they could get back into Ukraine. They didn't overextend themselves. The Russians put a huge effort into retaking Kursk, and about 50,000 troops have been involved. They've retaken about 40% of it. But the Ukrainians are still holding on to Sudza and about 60% of it. And believe me, they will want to hold on to that into the new year if they're going to have a bargaining chip, if they're going to talk about exchange of territories. Putin is desperate to get the whole of this back. He probably won't by January, February, because the Ukrainians are also very determined to hold on to it.
Yeah, and Michael, of course, we will talk about Kursk later as well, because that's where the North Koreans are. But I want to focus in on this port city of Odessa here. That still hasn't fallen, despite I guess, the Russians desperately wanting to try and take
Yeah, that's really important, Kamali, because when you look at Odessa, they tried to take it, didn't get past Mykolaiv. If they do take Odessa sometime in renewed fighting next year, then that effectively landlocks Ukraine. Odessa is the route to the south. It's the route out of the Black Sea into the Mediterranean. And the point is that keeps Ukraine in control of the western part of the Black Sea. Ukraine's big strategic victory this year has not been on land, it's been in controlling the western part of the Black Sea. They've effectively thrown the Russians out of Sevastopol, the base for the Black Sea fleet. So this is one big lifeline for Ukraine, strategic victory. It won't win them the war, but it stops them losing it.
Yeah, give us a quick thought about the way that they've been able to control the Black Sea as well with the technology they've used there, Michael.
Yeah, their own anti-ship missiles, use of drones. They've been very inventive. This is a country without a navy that has actually done something against the Black Sea Fleet, one of the most powerful navies in the world, and they've destroyed about a third of Russia's Black Sea Fleet.
Well, as new equipment and fresh technology have entered the battlefield in 2024, are we seeing a change in the dynamics of the conflict? Let's take a closer look at what's driving this war into new territory, something our teams on the ground experienced firsthand.
The drone is above us. It is absolutely relentless. An Iranian Shahed drone is flying over. They're tracking its flight, and they attack.
The reality of life under Russian fire.
It's not just a few drones which they were used to defending. It now can run into hundreds.
We have a lack of weapon, we have a lack of artillery, we have a lack of infantry.
I've got some breaking news for you now. President Biden has lifted restrictions on Ukraine using US weapons.
These army tactical missile systems, ballistic missiles.
It's not too late to affect the end game of this process.
Now, Michael, take us through how the dynamics of this war have changed.
Yeah, Kamali, I mean, drone attacks have been very characteristic, and we've seen drones of all shapes and sizes. To start with, we saw quite big drones. I mean, these are the Shahed 136s, the Iranian drones, which the Russians were using. They still use them in very high numbers. But what's interesting is that over the year, that evolution has really gone on. Drones are now much smaller. FPV drones, they're called, first-person view drones. So they're like hobby drones. They can follow somebody into a dugout. They can drop a grenade on them. They're almost like a substitute for artillery shells. And so what we find is that below 5,000 feet is a new form of warfare. It's drone warfare. Drone versus drone, electronics versus drones, completely new. I mean, drone warfare has increased tremendously during the year. Daily average number of drone attacks. There it is, building up towards November, December. Undoubtedly, that will be bigger than that. And that's just one element of all the other things that are coming in. So the new technologies, the Ukrainians were desperate for F-16s. They've got some of them are in operation. They're not a war winner, but they make some difference. Storm Shadow. The missiles, cruise missiles, there they are, carried on an aircraft, long range. They're very good against fixed targets, and the Ukrainians really want to use more and more of them and things like them. And, of course, ATACMS, the Army tactical missile system from the Americans, can be launched on a multiple launch rocket system. It's a ballistic missile, almost impossible to defend against, good range, and it actually destroys whatever it's pointed at. And, of course, the Ukrainians want to use these against targets inside Russia. Why do they want to do that? Because the Russians have developed glide bombs.
Right.
And glide bombs is an old-fashioned bomb. They do enormous damage, to civilian targets, to military targets. And essentially, the glide bomb is a big old bomb, but they've put fins on it. And a GPS guidance system, or a GLONASS system, which is the Russian version of GPS. And there it is, a good old-fashioned bomb with fins on it. And an aircraft that stays within Russian airspace can drop this, and it can glide up to 30 miles to its target and be reasonably accurate. And it's got such a big warhead, it doesn't have to be that accurate. And these have done immense damage to the front lines and to civilian targets throughout Ukraine. And the reason all this matters is because of the range of things like Storm Shadow. From a military point of view, the only way the Ukrainians can do something about the glide bombs is to attack the aircraft and the airfields from which they originate inside Russia. They can't really do anything about them once the glide bomb has been dropped. They have to go after the aircraft and the airfields, at least to force the Russians to pull back. outside that range. Militarily, that makes perfect sense. Politically, that's extremely sensitive because Western technology is being used to attack inside Russia. Big problem.
Yeah, now, Michael, taking all this into account, are we seeing an evolution of warfare?
Yeah, we do. I mean, Kamali, we see warfare at a full spectrum in Ukraine. On the one hand, it's ultra-modern. Some of the things we've seen, drone technologies, the use of space. But on another sense, it's like 19th century warfare. It's trenches, it's mud. It's people actually terrified out of their wits, having to fight each other. In a way, this war encapsulates a century and a half of military tactics and technology, all in one space. And it's pretty dreadful when you're in the middle of it.
It absolutely is. And Michael, they're learning from each of these engagements, aren't they, as well? And we're seeing it really progress. I mean, what are other nations taking from what they're seeing in the battlefield in
believe me, the Western world is really trying to learn from this. The Chinese are watching it very, very closely to see how tactics evolve. But we in the West, we know that Ukraine will have the most experienced, hard-bitten army in the Western world, and they're living this stuff. And we're also learning now how to modernise some of our kit from the bottom up. Instead of starting at the top down, just incrementally use something that's OK and just keep modernising, keep working from the bottom up. We're already trying to do that. And partly we've helped Ukraine, but Ukraine has helped us. We're all learning a lot from this.
Certainly. All right, Professor Clarke, thank you for that. You're watching a War in Ukraine special programme. It's still to come. What lies ahead in 2025 for Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky? We'll examine 3 possible scenarios on how the conflict could change. Well, welcome back to this War in Ukraine special. In many ways, 2024 was a year of contradictions. Now, never before have we seemed so close to a solution while at the same time edging ever closer to escalation. New global players and the politics of war expanding only serve to push these contradictions further apart.
After I win the presidency, we will have that horrible war between Russia and Ukraine settled, maybe in 24 hours. I think Zelensky's the greatest salesman in history. Every time he comes into the country, he walks away with $60 billion. Billion!
Donald Trump will be the 47th president of the United States of America.
First thing I'm going to do is call up Zelensky and call up President Putin, and I'm going to say, you gotta make a deal.
In my view of the newly elected president, he's quite a clever and experienced man. I think he will find a solution.
There are fears growing in the West that Russia could be about to deploy North Korean troops on the battlefield.
It is time to shift to a wartime mindset.
Are you saying now that Britain is directly involved in this war?
Absolutely.
I will prevent World War III.
So, Michael, take us through who the key players are in all of this.
Yeah, Kamali, I mean, everyone worries about proliferation in this war, the war getting more dangerous, but it actually proliferates horizontally. And the thing that's happening now, the war is a sort of a two-person war. Zelensky versus Putin, Ukraine fighting for its life against Russia, which is determined to suppress Ukraine and take it into the Russian Empire at some point. No mystery about that. Putin's been saying that for 10 years. But, of course, the real thing that's exploded all of this is the election of President Trump. So, in November, President Trump becomes the leader of the United States as of January, and this really will change the dynamics, because the dynamics now are that something more political has to happen, because he wants it to happen in early 2025. And, of course, he's got with him people in Europe now who are breaking the NATO consensus. 4 leaders, 4 countries in particular. In Slovakia, Robert Fico, Prime Minister of Slovakia. In Austria, Karl Nehammer, the Chancellor of Austria. In Hungary, Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary. And, of course, in Turkey, Erdogan, who is President of Turkey. These 4 countries are all very much Trumpist in their thinking. They don't think that Ukraine can win the war. They do think it's got to do a deal. They don't care in a way that Putin can be seen to win, as long as somehow the fighting stops. And so this very strong consensus that NATO had in 2022, that Putin must fail, we must do something to prevent this naked aggression, that consensus is now getting pretty thin, particularly in the southern part of Europe. Not in the north, but in the southern and Mediterranean part of Europe.
Now, this is the map of Europe, but there's another individual, isn't there, that's now having a role to play in all of this, someone from East Asia.
Yeah, horizontal proliferation doesn't come any more horizontal than pulling North Korea into it. Kim Jong-un has made a very big deal with Putin. I mean, the military alliance between them now is stronger than it's been since the early 1950s. And you look at the amount of equipment that North Korea has sent to Russia for this war. Putin could not continue this war at the tempo he's run it at this year without North Korean help. And it's not difficult in the sense that, from a North Korean port to a Russian port is a pretty short hop. And we know that 13,000 containers during this year have gone from one to the other. And at least 6,900 of those containers contain 3 million artillery shells. Wow. Absolutely fundamental to the Russian war effort. But the biggest horizontal proliferation, of course, is troops, in the sense that 10,000, maybe 11,000, some say even 15,000 troops have gone from North Korea to Kursk to fight for Russia inside Kursk. As proliferation goes, geographical proliferation, it doesn't come much more dramatic than that.
Indeed. And before we move on from this, Michael, what is the situation with those North Koreans in Kursk at the moment? They are in active conflict.
They are. They're taking losses. Early reports are that they're not doing very well. They're not terribly well trained. They're advancing in open order across big fields. They're being mown down. They will take a lot of losses unless they tighten up their tactics. But we'll see. If this experiment fails, they may not send any more. If it succeeds, they'll send 100,000, not 10,000, and that will make a difference to what goes on in Ukraine.
Definitely could. Now, Michael, you talked about the horizontal proliferation. What about the vertical one, the thing that we constantly hear about, the nuclear saber being rattled? I mean, how real is that threat? It keeps coming from the Russians when they feel like they're on the back foot.
The Russians constantly threaten the prospect of nuclear accidents, nuclear catastrophe. In reality, we're no nearer to a nuclear exchange now than before the war started. It's just Russia's rhetoric. But they ramp it up because they know it worries people. But there are no indications that the Russians are preparing to use nuclear weapons. There will be a lot of arguments against it. It would be difficult to think of a way in which they could use nuclear weapons to any advantage, actually, in such a big country as Ukraine, unless they used a lot of them, i.e. half a dozen at least in one place. It's very, very unlikely that would happen. But the spectre of nuclear blackmail keeps arising because it's something that the Russians find is quite effective.
Michael, why have we separated these two out, to strategic nuclear weapons and
the tactical nuclear weapons are the ones that people worry about might be used in Ukraine. It would make
on the battlefield, right?
Battlefield nuclear weapons. Destroyers. Strategic, of course, are weapons that are directed against a homeland, against Western Europe, against the United States. And there you're talking about outright nuclear war. We're no nearer to that than we were 10 years ago.
OK, Professor Clarke, thank you for that. So look, we turn to the question now of what comes next. It's something that both President Zelensky and Putin will surely be thinking about in 2025. Our chief correspondent, Stuart Ramsey, sat down with Zelensky, who, for the first time, hinted at a ceasefire deal that could include Russian control of some Ukrainian territory.
No one has offered us to be in NATO with just one part or another part of Ukraine. That's for once. The fact is that it is a solution to stop the hot stage of the war, because we can just give the NATO membership to the part of Ukraine that is under our control. Yes, it could be possible, but no one offered. But the invitation must be given to Ukraine within its internationally recognized border. You can't give invitation to just one part of a country. Why? Because thus you would recognize that Ukraine is only that territory of Ukraine and the other one is Russia. So, legally, by law, we have no right to recognize the occupied territory as territory of Russia.
I mean, a fascinating insight into how his thinking has changed, Professor Clarke. I mean, what do you think we're going to see next in this?
Nobody knows. The only thing we're fairly confident about is it will be different. 2025 will probably be different in various ways. We don't know really what President-elect Trump thinks, but we know what a key person thinks, who is his special ambassador for Ukraine and Russia, and that is Keith Kellogg.
Yep.
He's a retired general, and Keith Kellogg, along with Fred Fleitz, wrote a report in April this year which was very critical of Biden's handling of the war. And the last couple of pages of this report outlined what a ceasefire might look like. So that's quite a reasonable indication of the way in which Trump's advisors might be moving him along. And out of that, you get the possibility of three things arising, three scenarios. And these scenarios obviously are sort of idealised scenarios. But the first scenario is one in which the Ukrainians are just told, you can't get any more equipment, you've got to stop. So it's a ceasefire in place, which is pretty bad for Ukraine, with only sort of paper guarantees that it will hold. So everybody signs up to all sorts of ringing declarations, and of course they don't hold. Right. And the Russians haven't observed any of the agreements they've made since 2000 on any territorial issues. And I'm confident that if that happened, if there was a ceasefire in place with only paper guarantees, within about a year, maybe 18 months or whatever, the Russians would break out of it and they'd try and take the area towards Kiev, they'd take the eastern cities. They would try to hold on to all of the area east of the Dnieper River, because this is the sort of most Russianized part of Ukraine, always was, the industrial part. To the west of the Dnieper River is agricultural Ukraine. But I also think that they would try to go for Odessa, for the reasons we mentioned before, in order to landlock an essentially agricultural Ukraine and make it a non-viable state. I think that's what would happen if we had a ceasefire in place with no proper guarantees.
So that's one. The second one?
Second one is a ceasefire in place, same area, but with a demilitarised zone and something very specific. Now, and what Keith Kellogg is talking about is you could have a demilitarised zone, you'd have to have Western troops, good troops, who would occupy that zone, and the zone is very long. It's well over 1,000 kilometres. So key question is, who's going to do it? What sort of rules of engagement do they have? If they're attacked by, say, Ukrainians against Russians, Russians against Ukrainians, will they fight back? Who's going to pay for it? There are huge questions arising from all of this, but it's the only way in which you could say, well, there'll be a stabilised front line, lots of aid to Ukraine, lots of economic aid, lots of military aid to give Ukraine the chance to be strong enough that this DMZ in 5 years, 10 years' time might be able to be dissolved. That's pretty optimistic, but that's the second version. That's the Keith Kellogg version.
And the third?
Third version is that neither of these things really work out and the war continues.
Yeah.
And if the war continues, it's not obvious that Ukraine will lose. They might lose more territory during the year, certainly if they lose American aid. But the Russians are facing a really difficult time economically in the second half of the year and into 2026. So the longer this war goes on, the more it will expose Russia's deep structural weaknesses, economic weaknesses, and who knows, I mean, the wheel could turn in lots of different ways. The reality is that none of these scenarios are probably going to play out straightforwardly. Reality is always messy, and it'll probably be some combination of any two of the three. Not all three, but any two of the three will end up in some sort of real-world messy combination. But either way, whatever happens next year will be different to 2024.
And now, with all we know about Zelensky and who's going to be moving into the White House in 2025, how do you think the war could end the next year?
I don't think we'll see the war end. The war is generational. The Russians are determined to take Ukraine. And that means it will go on for 40, 50, 60 years. But the fighting might come to an end now, and then the wheel will turn and we'll see if fighting starts up again in 2 or 3 years' time. So it's possible to think about a ceasefire or a stationary conflict. But the idea of peace, whereby both sides sit peacefully next to each other, is very hard to imagine this side of 2060, 2070.
My goodness, right. Scott, thank you for that. And thank you, as always, for your expertise. Now, Sky News is going to carry on reporting from the ground, bringing you all you need to know about the war in 2025. But for now, from Michael and from me, thanks for watching.